Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they did. They absolutely got it right. And you have heard me say that over and over for years now. Yes, this is Tom Navolis, your host, and I am very delighted that you are joining me today as we talk about the mirrors of history and the tragedies which have occurred within the context, especially within our foundational period. And it's relevant to what is going on today and what is happening with all of this on the Chinese virus, which I think is appropriate to be calling it. And I'm not going to get into all of the various theories about the whys and the wherefores, but I am going to focus today on an issue here in Ohio State, which I think becomes a conversational, educational issue within every state of this nation. And primarily that involves what is happening around Ohio and the fact that our election was canceled. And more than it was canceled, it was the timing and the means and the mechanisms by which it was canceled, and then the discussions that have been going forth in respect to that. So we're going to jump into that here in a little while. But I want to start out with, for those that know, that one of the ways that we are supporting this program to an extent, it's supporting Kath and I, that then supports this program, because we don't have anybody that donates to us or gives us any money. So this is all self-funded, as many of you know, and maybe you don't know that. But those in Ohio, if you are interested in supporting us, I would ask, and you can see it at the bottom of the screen, is go to pepper-licious.com and buy some of our jams. We can't go to any events right now. The Ice Wine Festival, the last week of that was canceled. The big farmers market was canceled. And then we're not sure that the farmers markets that will be starting up or should start up on May 9th, that those may be canceled. So there is a direct impact, but there shouldn't be, because we sell online. And anybody that is interested in supporting this program and wants some of our hot pepper products, and especially those fabulous jams, well then, as you've been seeing it going on the bottom of your page, go to pepper-licious.com, check out what we have and support us. So in looking at then all that has been going on, let me look at something that's happened here, something that has happened, and an emphasis on that. It was a day in November. Well, wait a minute. The virus wasn't happening in November. In China it was. There were things that were starting to happen here, but more importantly, this has happened. And it wasn't in November. Okay, 1721, a small bomb hurled through the window of a local Boston reverend. Did you hear about that? Did you know about that historically? A bomb thrown through a reverend's window. Well, that reverend was named Cotton Mather. Attached to the explosive, which fortunately did not explode, was a message. Quote, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you! I'll inculcate you with this, with a pox to you," end quote. Now, wait a minute. This wasn't a religiously motivated issue at all. What it was a response to Cotton Mather's active promotion of a smallpox inoculation. You see, as we have things going on today, smallpox ravaged our founding era, especially during this revolutionary period. So this was 1721. that this happened. And you have to understand that Boston was almost at the epicenter. As Boston was at the epicenter of our liberty, as Boston was at the epicenter of Samuel Adams then being born in 1722, the fact of the matter is Samuel Adams could have died at birth because of the number of children that were dying because of smallpox, or parents dying because of smallpox, people dying. So here's the statistics for you, those that like statistics. Out of a population of 11,000, there were over 6,000 cases. Do the math. Come on, you mathematicians out there. That was the reported cases, with 850 dying from the disease. Of a series of 7 epidemics in the region during the 1700s, this was the most deadly. Though tragic, the 1721 epidemic led to a major milestone in the history of vaccination and smallpox eradication. This was during that revolutionary period of time. And when we look at what was happening right there in Boston, and you look at those statistics, and you look now at even the global statistic, or let's take it back a little bit on the statistics relative to the flu season in America. I'm not going to go through all of that. You can go through those numbers. You can go back and you can listen to President Trump's different speeches, his updates that have been given. You could go to the CDC, you can look it up there. But the reality is, where we sit right now is that when we do a mathematical comparison just for Boston, okay, New York is the hot spot in America. And you could do the numbers for those that are interested in here. Boston had 11,000 people and 6,000 cases. Wow. Isn't that, let's see, that's what, almost 2/3 of the population? 850 die. There were a series of epidemics. And here we have our president, this president, dealing better with any 20th century epidemic, 19th century epidemic, pulling all the various resources together that have taken and allowed us to do what we're doing now and not have the tragedy of the numbers of deaths. So it takes leadership. And leadership in what was happening as far as taking care of the disease, taking care of smallpox, taking care of now this virus that is attacking us, how it has been used potentially as warfare. And that's what we're going to talk about really in the second and third segment. But I want to set this historical basis for you first before we talk about the Ohio State Constitution, before we talk about the revised Code of Ohio, and before we talk about how we balance what's going on with the coronavirus and liberty, because they all tie together. So let's reference back through a little bit more and looking at this whole thing on the smallpox virus and what was happening. So I mentioned to you the whole period of 1721, 1722, and what happened in Boston in itself. But when we look at a broader history, we can see that in a period between 1775 and 1782, that North America was in the throes of another total smallpox epidemic. Wait a minute. Isn't that the period that the Revolutionary War was going on? What was happening? And we have to look for leadership. What was the leadership at that time? Look, I gotta say, it was George Washington. You know, I'm not going to make this total comparison between what was going on with George Washington and with Donald Trump. But I got to tell you, there are some really unique alignments between the two, and the fact that there was some real leadership that stood up, not just, someone that understood business, but someone that understood the totality of what it would take to unite the people and deal with things. So here it was during the siege of Boston. Washington was losing as many troops to smallpox as he was losing to the war. In fact, many more were getting sick. They were getting sick from it than what was happening from the battles that were going on and all of the different folks that were impacted by this. So we have to understand that in 1775 it was raging, both British occupied Boston, the Continental Army was even in that invasion going to Canada. You hear me talk about what the pastors who went to be chaplains during the Revolutionary period, they were dealing with sicknesses, and part of those sicknesses was with smallpox. And you had to come to terms with what was going on. We had different escaped slaves that were coming across from the south, and they had smallpox, and they died. It was reaching into Texas even, and into New Orleans through 1778 and 79. I mean, it was just going across, and especially during that Revolutionary War period. So what was it that George Washington finally had to do? I mean, he was quarantining people. It was the whole idea of what was happening with not only that, what was called this camp fever, which was malaria, diphtheria, and scarlet fever was raging through. We didn't have the inoculations at that time. But what we did have during the period that Washington had to make a decision on was the health of the men in the army, and what are you going to do with the troops? So he did. He inoculated his troops. And at that time, the method of inoculation for smallpox was to make a small cut and to take some of that smallpox pus and infect a localized area. And that was that early method of inoculation. It was very interesting. Martha Washington finally got inoculated. John and Abigail did. There was just a lot there that had to be dealt with. And we see that what made the big turn, or made a turn for the Washington's army at the time also, was the fact that he was willing to take that step and ensure that the troops were inoculated from smallpox. Still meant that there was diphtheria, and they had to deal with that. There was still, whatever else went on with camp fever, and how do you deal with malaria? We had to deal with that as well. But it was the leadership. It was the leadership being proactive. It was the leadership taking and looking at what method would be there that could take and, once again, take care of the people, but also to ensure that America could come around strongly and be able to defeat its enemy. Today, the enemy is a virus. We've heard that we are on a war footing all the way into now the states. So that's what we're going to talk about when we come back into the second and third segment. What is that emergency power? We hear at the federal level the emergency powers being enacted. We hear that governors are doing different things. We have a number of patriots. I mean, I was really upset that the election in Ohio was canceled. But then when you step back and you take a look, what is the constitutional power? What are those? You can't just quote one or two sections of the Constitution, the state Constitution, and not look at what the powers say and then how it becomes codified. These are the things that Sam Adams and the Anti-Federalists talked about in constitutionalism overall. And you know something? As I always say, those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right. And as always, this is Tom Novolis, your host. I've never had anybody host the program other than myself. I've had other guests on, which is wonderful. And the fact that we are on Liberty Works Radio Network, and I am delighted for everyone that's there, and especially that you're taking the time to probably spend more time listening to the radio, listening to internet radio broadcast, and just taking and enjoying what you can learn and do even online. So the first thing that you can do online is look for that donate button there and click on it and participate, because this is a network that upholds your liberties and freedoms. I also want to just go back from the first segment and say, for those that are interested in supporting this program and through Pepperlicious, yeah, it's only for folks in the state of Ohio. Sorry about that out there in every other state, but we are an Ohio cottage industry, so that means we cannot sell outside of the state of Ohio. So for those in Ohio, it is pepper-licious.com. So you can read that on the bottom of the screen again. So let's kind of take a dive here. And I don't mean a nose dive to get a bloody nose dive or anything like that. But in the last segment, we talked about leadership. We talked about the viruses in the early turn of the century. I mean, of the revolution. They're right there in 1721, 1722, miracle that Sam Adams was born. And then it carried on through the whole Revolutionary War. So this morning, Kath and I were kind of talking about, wow, here we are in this thing, and, it looks so disastrous and blah, 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 blah. And then we started talking a little bit more, and we're going, you know what, this country has not ever not been involved in some kind of a crisis. And that being that if you take and you look, we walk out of the Revolutionary War, we get the Constitution in place by 1789 when it was fully implemented. We had to go through this issue of, okay, now we got to do some amendments, and on it went. And then by 1812, we're back at war with England. Oh, wow, interesting. And that was a war here in the U.S. Remember, the Capitol was burned down. Here in Ohio, we had the battles on Lake Erie. Out in the West, they had different battles out there. So it was interesting. And then we look and we're going, okay, got that settled. And here we go, 1860s, we're in a civil war. A civil war. Killed millions of brothers, sisters, family members. Disease, pestilence occurred. Food shortages. The need for helping neighbor. Important. And I want to take you back to the foundation of this country. It was a pastor's house being bombed, if you will. But it was the pastors. It was the churches. It was our Christian foundation, prayer before God, that continuously pulled us together. It wasn't not a shock to me that when our President Trump called for a national day of prayer, that we would have so many come against him, because we have so wandered through the desert of ideology that now, okay, science is your God. Okay, you know what? The social justice is your God. All these other things are your God. You see, as I will always say, is that if you do not have the biblical God of the universe as your God, everything else will be your God, including government, including all of the things that I already mentioned. So, not to belabor that, I want to kind of move into the conversation a little bit that I had with a fellow patriot regarding the Constitution of the state of Ohio, regarding the idea that the actions of Governor DeWine were unconstitutional. Look, I was upset that here it was, literally close to the midnight hour, that through an action, the election was suspended. It was pushed off. It was pushed off, I think, now until June 2nd. And I was so upset that Kath and I really didn't find out, because we were watching what was happening earlier in the day, and the idea that they were going to do this, and you had Secretary of State out there saying, "Oh yeah, this is a good thing to do," and here it is the day before the election, and they're trying to make this decision. And the interesting thing was, it went to the court, and the court down there in close to Columbus said, "You know what? We don't want to touch this. This is like too close. This is too big of a deal, and no, the election should go on." So then it was interesting. I can just see, the governor picking up the phone and calling the Supreme Court justices to, gather together to make a decision on that. And the Supreme Court sided with the governor and said, "No, you can take and postpone the election." And so then he made I call it the midnight decree. It was earlier than that, in the evening, but it was, at that, I call it the midnight hour, witching hour. And okay, the election was postponed, is the correct terminology. That is the codified terminology. So I was, Kath and I didn't know that for sure. We read something in the morning when we got up, but we said, "You know what, we're going to the polls anyway. I mean, we're not seeing anything, okay, it looks official. Come on, who's going to really do that? Especially, we didn't see the Supreme Court decision, so the state Supreme Court. So we went ahead and we went to the polls. It was kind of funny. The story goes is that just ahead of us by a matter of, literally watching the guy park and turn his lights off, was a highway patrolman in the parking lot there. Sure enough, the parking lot where the poll should have been set up and everything like that, empty, except for the state trooper. So we, wheel along next to him, roll the window down, and be cordial with him, and ask him. I said, "Come on, what do you know about the election being canceled?" He goes, "Wow, I don't even know about that." So he calls up dispatch, and dispatch says, "Yeah." He goes, "Man, I don't get that." So he calls up the supervisor, and the supervisor goes, "Yeah, the election's canceled." He goes, "Man, I didn't know that." So, he confirmed it, and we thanked him, and then we went off to do some shopping that we needed to do. And that's another story about people hoarding, and all of the stores, the shelves virtually bare. But the point here is that, did the governor have the authority to postpone the election? And that's the key term, postpone the election. Well, so a lot of people are getting all upset. "No, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. We have this constitutional crisis going on in Ohio." A legislator, one of the very predominant people in the Patriot movement here in Ohio, came out with this whole thing, especially on Thursday. And I got involved in a little back and forth with some of our Patriot friends in regards to, and as you saw in the newsletter that I put out on Thursday, is, yeah, the governor had every right to take and postpone the election. And what I do is I take and I let everybody know that based on the Ohio Revised Code 161 for emergencies, and in particular, Ohio Revised Code 161.09, which says postponing elections. So let me read that to you, and we're going to end up picking all of this up and talking about the Constitution itself in the third segment. So the Ohio Revised Code 161.09, postponing elections, says, in the event of an emergency resulting from an enemy attack, the governor, his successor, or interim successor shall, and that has a comma after it, when in his judgment the public interest requires, postpone any state or local election for a period not exceeding 6 months. When, because of conditions resulting from an enemy attack, a scheduled election is not held or scheduled appointments cannot be made, the elected or appointed incumbent of affected offices of their emergency interim successor shall continue to hold office until the successors are elected or appointed and duly qualified. Well, what constitutes an emergency? What constitutes that which would give that governor, the governor of Ohio, the right to exercise, to do what that subparagraph says? Well, in the definitions, emergency interim government, which is chapter 161 of the Ohio Revised Code, 161.01 are the definitions, and part D says, quote, attack means any attack or series of attacks by an enemy of the United States causing or which may cause substantial damage or injury to civilian property or persons in the state in any manner by sabotage or by any use of bombs, missiles, shell fire, or atomic, radiological, chemical, bacteriological, or biological means or other weapons or processes. Wow, that's a pretty broad definition. And quite frankly, it scares me. This was done in 1963. The effective date of this was on September 30th, 1963. And we'll take a consideration of the historical perspective of it very briefly, figure out what was going on in the 60s, early 60s like that, with the Cold War, what was happening with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had a lot of things that the legislature at the time went ahead and codified what an emergency interim government should be, and defining what that means in that attack, and defining what then that means in that subparagraph 9.09, what it means to take and postpone an election. Well, we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the next section, because my friends, my patriotic friends in Ohio said, well, the Constitution trumps anything in the Ohio Revised Code. And the Constitution, though, has to authorize the ability of the legislature to do this. And that's some of what we're going to talk about in the third segment. And it's always interesting that anything that goes into a constitution and then ends up being codified are those types of things that Sam Adams and the Anti-Federalists were warning about, were wary about, in that we have to look as a people to what those extending consequences could be. And so Sam Adams, he was always trying to warn us to be very wise about what we would legislate. And the Anti-Federalists understood that when we looked at what the Constitution would do. So come on back in the third segment as we dive into this even further. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they absolutely got it right. And we're just going to jump right into it. But I do want to say again in this program that with the fact that we can't go anywhere, we help support the program for those that are in Ohio. It's down here, bottom of your screen. Look at pepper-licious.com and get some of our fantastic pepper products and our jams. They're amazing. So with that said, we're going to talk about the Ohio State Constitution, as well as Chapter 161 of the Ohio Revised Code, not cold. If you have a cold, be cautious. But the Chapter 161, the Emergency Interim Government. In the definition, as we said in the last section, and oh yeah, welcome back. I almost forgot all you folks there. I call you the Screaming Eagle, but everybody down there in Lima, Ohio at Soaring Eagle Radio, you know what? I'm just delighted that you're back here in this segment as well. So thanks for joining us back again in this third segment. But what we were talking about in the last segment, you have and folks there in Lima, go ahead and get to SamuelAdamsReturns.net, and that's for everybody, where you can get the archives of the program. All of that is there, both the podcast. You can even find it on iHeart, the podcast, as well as then seeing my smiling face on a video. YouTube is right there in those archives. Jump on in and enjoy it all, but get to that second segment, because I think that was important, what we had to say in relationship to this chapter. So just going real quick, what's an attack? And what's that emergency interim government? Well, it gives certain powers, and those powers in that is any type of an attack. And in paragraph D of 161.01 of the ORC, it goes through there, and check it out. There's links there at SamuelAdamsReturns.net, and it talks about bacteriological or biological means that our enemies would be attacking us. Now, we have an economic enemies all over the place. China is, in my opinion, an economic enemy. So by virtue of this definition, it then goes into section right there, 161.09, postponing elections. And the governor has a right to do that for up to 6 months. Okay, very interesting. Now, what is continuing to be interesting is a conversation that I email back and forth a little bit on something from our patriot friends here in Ohio and the Ohio Constitution, and saying that, oh no, the governor, he can't do that. It's unconstitutional that he can do that. Everything has to be changed, through the legislature, and blah, blah, on and on. Not that it was a bad conversation. I want to be clear on that. It was really good. And it really comes down to is the unintended consequences that happen through a legislature. And agreeable, absolutely agreeable. It is the responsibility of the legislature to do certain things. So, in the Bill of Rights was one of the first quotations that a patriot friend put up, is a suspension of laws. And that is Section 18 of Article 1, which is the Bill of Rights in the Ohio Constitution. Well, stop a second. What I indicated to my friends, and I will say, and I have said in other programs over the years, hey folks, have you ever bothered to read your state constitution? Do you know what it says? Well, what about the federal Constitution? Have you bothered to read it? And as I indicated to a friend of mine that we emailing back and forth, is that the majority of people, including patriots in the state of Ohio, nonetheless, all over this nation, have never even read the preamble of their state constitution, let alone any of the articles or the subsections that matter. So, with that, back to this subsection 18 of Article 1 of the Ohio State Constitution, which is the suspension of laws, which was the first quote in this rather large email that went out, which is paragraph 18. No power of suspending laws shall ever be exercises except by the General Assembly. Great, that's the legislature. I get that. That's, yeah, okay, the legislature has that. And in one of my comments back in relationship to this, I indicated that I thought that in Article 2 of the Constitution, and actually, let's stay within Article 1, subsection 20, is powers reserved to the people. This enumeration of rights shall not be construed to impair or deny otherwise retained by the people, and all powers not herein delegated remain with the people, which is important because when you go to Article 2, Section 1, in whom power is vested, Section 1 says, the legislative power of the state shall be vested in the General Assembly, consisting of a Senate and House of Representatives, but the people reserve to themselves the power to propose to the General Assembly laws and amendments to the Constitution and to adopt or reject the same at the polls on a referendum vote as hereafter provided. Then it goes into the whole thing on how the General Assembly functions, operates, and all of that. And then it became extremely interesting that my friends were, contending that the Constitution does not give any of those codified powers that I mentioned in the ORCs. Well, I got to say that as I was rereading the Ohio State Constitution, and it's got a lot of stuff in there. It's like it's real. What people allowed to go into the Constitution. I moved back to Ohio just 5 years ago, but what I've seen happen over the number of years, I'm clunking my head and going, "Hey, folks, why'd you let this happen?" But as I indicate in my seminars and in my book, from Covenant to the Present Constitution, dealing with the federal Constitution, is that the legislatures have codified and the Supreme Courts have taken and brought into being a bunch of stuff that just doesn't make sense. But let's go on here. So we're still in this on Section 2 of the Ohio State Constitution, and we are in 1D, 1 Delta, and it says emergency laws not subject to referendum. And this is here, it says that laws providing for taxes, levies, appropriations for the current expense of the state government and state institutions, and emergency laws necessary for the immediate preservation of the public peace, health, or safety shall go into immediate effect. Well, the discussion would be that, wait a minute, that wasn't a law. That was something that the executive branch put into effect. No, stop. So what we have, if we look historically, once again, is back in 1960s, early 60s, 1960 through 61 through 63, 65. We had some very interesting times dealing with the Cold War, dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis, dealing with the assassination of a president, So in 1963, something was enacted. It was enacted, and what was enacted that then gives the governor the full right to execute was what we just talked about earlier, is the Ohio Revised Code 161, and giving those emergency powers in the case of attack. Now, it becomes interesting is that in dealing with referendum, dealing with laws and how that fits in there and how that is subject to it. Now, you gotta take, and you have to understand the context by which that was put into place. And that was put into place back in 1912 in giving that general power and talking about it in emergency action, emergency time and point of reference. So let's go into another component which can be used and which the governor can exercise in through another section of our Constitution. And in this section is a section, again, on how does the legislature, what can they do in codifying and what's important. So here it is in the welfare of employees. And this is all in, Article 2. And here we have welfare of employees. Paragraph 34. Laws may be passed fixing and regulating hours of labor, establishing a minimum wage, and providing for the comfort, health, safety, and general welfare of all employees, and no other provisions of the Constitution shall impair or limit this power. I think we'd have to go back and start looking at the discussions and the arguments during the time that 161 was passed in 1963 to clearly understand what else was going on that brought that about. So here we go into Article 3 in the executive. And this is called the continuity of government operations in emergencies caused by enemy attack. There's that word attack. And this was in 1961 that this amendment was made to the Ohio State Constitution. And this is Section 42. The General Assembly shall have the power and the immediate duty to pass laws to provide for prompt and temporary succession to the powers and duties of public officers of whatever nature, and whether filled by election or appointment, the incumbents of which may become unavailable for carrying on the powers and duties of such offices, and to pass, here it is, and to pass such other laws as may be necessary and proper for ensuring the continuity of governmental operations in periods of emergency resulting from disasters caused by enemy attacks. 1961. Okay, there's the authorization constitutionally for what then is ORC 161. And those words are lifted right out of the state constitution and utilized then in that code. It is used in 161. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate everybody and looking at the Constitution. When I argue in my seminar and in my books, is that people jump up and down saying, it's the Constitution. Look at what the Constitution says. It's the Constitution. What does the Constitution say? Both the federal Constitution and the state. And then what becomes codified, not only in your state and my state's revised code, but what was codified there in the U.S. Code, United States Code. So much. So when we say we want our elected officials, and I say this all the time, to stand on the Constitution, they are. But we have to understand the Constitution. We have to understand what is in our documents. So here's my challenge to you. While you're sitting at home, self whatever, read your state constitution. Read it. Read it. Read the federal Constitution. get a sense of what they have to say. You got time on your hands? Sam Adams read it. The Anti-Federalist argued against it for a lot of various reasons. And if we want to make changes to these things that we saw in 1963, you better know what you're talking about. Come on back next week.